All right. I'm glad that you guys are here this morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and get them out. We're going to be in 2 Timothy. 2 Timothy. Pastor Adam preached on 2 Timothy 1 last week. We're going to be in 2 Timothy 4 this morning, and then head into Hebrews as we're trying to finish 27 and 22. We've been in 27 and 22 this whole year, discovering the New Testament, walking through Matthew to Revelation. And as we kind of head towards December and ending the year, we find ourselves closing out the pastoral letters and then heading into Hebrews next week. But 2 Timothy chapter 4. 2 years ago, 2020, there was a documentary that went viral during the pandemic called The Last Dance. Does anybody remember this? Anybody watch this? First couple episodes, millions of followers, millions of watchers on ESPN. But the sermon titled Last Dance, if you're taking notes, this is a basketball documentary series, how in 1997, the coach of the Chicago Bulls, Phil Jackson, announced it would be his last season coaching. He called it the final dance. This documentary series depicts how Michael Jordan, which is the real GOAT in basketball, all right, it depicts how Michael Jordan and his teammates rallied together and gave it their all one last time to take the championship. If you're taking notes, I want you to write this down at the very top. When you know how to go out, you know how to go forward. You know how to live when you know how to die. 2 Timothy, Paul writes this from Rome to Timothy as he awaits his death. His concern is not for himself, which is interesting and weird to us, but his concern is for Timothy in the advancement of the gospel. This pastoral letter, this short letter is very personal. It's very intentional. A lot of emotion is written into it from Paul to Timothy, encouraging him to be faithful. God would soon move Paul off the scene, and Timothy would take his place and continue to give spiritual leadership to the churches. This wouldn't be an easy task, but with God's direction and help, anything is possible. And in chapter 4, we see Paul's last words to Timothy before he dies. This is interesting. In chapter 4 alone, there is over 17 people mentioned in this chapter. 17 individuals, which kind of tells us that Paul was not just a friend maker, an extrovert, always meeting people, always building relationships with people, but Paul was always about advancing the gospel, and he was a soul winner. 17 individuals, probably more, way more, was impacted by the gospel, and the gospel could go farther and faster because of one individual named Paul. As we begin this morning, I have that same question for you. As you come into this room, maybe for the first time, maybe every single week, how are you investing in other people to take the gospel farther and faster? As we dive into chapter 4, Paul talks about his life presently, his life in the past, and his life in the future, all wrapped up in just a few verses. And so chapter 4, verse 6, we're going to begin this morning and take this verse by verse and how this can be applied to your life. I want to encourage you to grab your worship guide, hopefully take notes, and we'll respond and conclude this morning. But it says this in 2 Timothy 4, verse 6, For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, for my departure has come. If you're taking notes, you can write this down. The first thing Paul does is Paul looks around. He looks around at his circumstances, at his situations, and realizes that his time is very short. He knew that the end was near, and he doesn't avoid the subject. He doesn't not want to talk about it, because it's weird for us as individuals as we come into this room, including myself. It's hard to talk about the end. No one wants to talk about death. In fact, it's one of the biggest fears that we have in our culture and society is the fear of death, the fear of everything ending. And Paul doesn't avoid it. He's very open about it. And he doesn't just know he's about to die, but he knows how he's going to die. Paul is a Roman citizen, and in that day, he was exempt from crucifixion. And so Paul knew exactly his death. He was going to get decapitated. And Paul turns us to the Old Testament scriptures. He takes us back to Exodus and Numbers and explains what this burnt offering and drink offering is. And so to go there, in the Old Testament, there was an offering called the burnt offering. And this was an offering that an animal was killed and wholly consumed for the sin of the people. Because when there's sin demands a sacrifice. There has to be blood that is shed for your sin and for my sin. And so in the Old Testament, this is how they got the relationship back into standing with God. This is how the sin was atoned for by a sacrifice. And so this burnt offering was an animal that was wholly consumed, and there was oil and flour and herbs and senses that was on this. And then Paul describes this drink offering. There was a drink offering of wine that and other things that was put on this offering. And what that would do is it would go into the air as a pleasing aroma to God, knowing that it smells good, your sin is atoned for, it is satisfying, it is pleasing, it is good. And what Paul is explaining in this passage of Scripture, he's going back to that and he's saying, this is my life. 30 years of faithfulness, 30 years my life has been consumed for His glory. And to top it off, I'm about to be executed, and the spilling of my blood at that time is like a drink offering to God. Now, Paul has been in prison many times, but Paul has been in prison in Rome many times as well. And so remember, Paul's goal in life is to make it to Rome. His number one purpose in life is to make it to Rome, because Paul believes if he can make it to Rome, the gospel can go farther and faster. And so he makes it to Rome, and we see in Philippians, we see he's in Rome, he's in jail, and he didn't know if he was going to live or die, but he said this in Philippians 2, verse 17. It says, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and I will rejoice with you all. Paul doesn't know if he's going to live or die. Then it was hypothetical in Philippians, but now it is real in 2 Timothy. And he isn't afraid of it. Nor should we be afraid of death. Especially as believers, especially as people that come into this room that have said yes to Jesus Christ. You've put your faith and trust in Him. You've been changed by the good news of Jesus and the gospel. We don't have a fear of death. We have something greater. We have Jesus. Jesus is the greatest person you can ever encounter in your life. And as a Christ follower, death has no hold on you. When you live with death in mind, you live differently. You do. You don't know when it is going to happen. You don't schedule your own death. It's not 8 o'clock, I'm going to eat cereal for breakfast. I'm going to go to the gym. I'm going to go to work. 12 o'clock comes lunch. 2 o'clock, I'm going to die. We don't schedule our death. And death can be one of those words that it can be challenging. Some of you have experienced family. Some of you have experienced friends. Some of you have experienced those words in life that can define and change everything of who you are. And death is one of those words. Some of you know my story, but I was 12 years old, 7 days before my 13th birthday, and my dad died with a massive heart attack. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I remember everything about that day. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've experienced a parent, you've experienced a friend, you've experienced a coworker. You've guided people through those stories and through those life transitions. And death can be one of those things that we try to avoid. We try not to talk about it. But there's something about when you live with the end in mind, you live differently. It says this in Hebrews 9, verse 27. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment. Here's a statistic for you. 1 out of every 1 person dies. There is going to come a place, there is going to come a time that you will take your last breath and you will take your first breath in either heaven or hell. Everyone has an appointed time in life. You don't schedule it. You don't prepare for it. I have a certain amount of time. This lifetime is going to cost me my life, and I want you to write this down. I want to invest it, not waste it. Paul deals with this as he talks about this. Paul lived a life of investing it and not wasting it. And I'm just going to be real and honest with you, even straight from a pastor, as I studied this passage of Scripture, as I allowed God to speak into my heart and speak into my mind, I was convicted. Because even as a pastor, I fail every day, and even as a pastor, I struggle and I make mistakes. There's not one person in this room that's perfect. And if you know me, I'm wired to go. I'm wired to move. That's just who I am. I'm 100% an extrovert. I'm a 3 in the Enneagram. And when I hit my pillow at night, I'm done. But I'm going from the time I wake up to the time I'm going to bed. And one thing that convicted me was this. And I believe there's some people in here that are living this way, especially fathers. Can I just speak to you, fathers? How are you investing your time in your family? Because at the end of the day, when you die, you're going to get rehired in your job. They are going to find a replacement for you, but you will never be replaced as a father. You will never be replaced as a husband. How are you investing your time with your family? You can't buy time, you can buy money. How are you investing your time in other people? The people that God has designed to be in your inner circle, but the opportunity that God has designed for people to be all around you everywhere you go in your workplace. Not just fathers, but mothers, individuals, teens, students, college students. Everywhere we go, we are surrounded by people that God has given us the opportunity to invest in. 17 individuals that this gospel can now go farther and faster. Just in 2 Timothy chapter 4, because one individual sought his life outside of his own eyes into the eyes of Jesus and said, I'm going to invest it. How are you investing your time growing closer to Jesus? Just like that song we just sang a couple of minutes ago, are you making more room for Jesus in your life? Or are you living life just wasting it, going through the motions? Can I tell you something? You were created more than just going to work 8 to 5. You were created for more just to run through the certain routine of agendas of life day by day, week by week, month by month. You were created for more. And as Paul leads by example in the last statements he says in 2 Timothy, he says, I want to invest it. And I've lived a life that shows that. Giving away temporary things and focusing on eternal things. You're not going to take anything to heaven. The only thing that's going to go to heaven is people. And how are you spending your time investing in people? Paul then goes on to say in verse 7, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. A popular verse that we see on coffee mugs, t-shirts, and so many things. Most of us maybe have this memorized, but Paul, when he refers to this verse, what he's doing is he's looking back. Paul looked around in his situations and circumstances in verse 6, and now in verse 7, Paul is looking back in his life. He's looking at the times when he had the conversion and said yes to Jesus, and he's been following Jesus, the missionary trips, the people he's invested in. He's looking back at everything he's done, and he's saying, I've fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Paul summed up his whole life in this one verse. Now, Paul was not perfect, but Paul was faithful. I've done it. It's completed. I am satisfied with it. And there's 3 areas you can see in your worship guide with this one verse that Paul looks at. Number 1, he says, I'm a soldier. I'm a soldier. He says, I've fought the good fight. Understand that you are in a battle. We are in a war as Christ followers. From the time you wake up to the time that you go to bed, the choices that we make, the areas that we're led, and the people that we invest in and the people we don't invest in, we are in a battle every single day. And I want you to write this down because sometimes this can be taken out of context, because a lot of times when we say yes to Jesus, we have this cookie cutter idea of everything is going to be easy now. Life is going to be relaxed. It's going to be filled with gold stars, and life is going to be easy. But that's not what the Bible talks about. It's, in fact, the opposite. When Paul refers to himself as a soldier, what he's telling Timothy and what he's telling all of us is the Christian life is not a playground, it's a battleground. It's not easy being a Christian. You're going to walk out these doors and you're going to get persecuted. You're going to get mocked. The enemy is going to be at your doorstep. He's going to be in your vehicle. He's going to be with your inner circle. He wants to steal, kill, and destroy your life. But we have Jesus, who is greater than any of those things. And we've got to put on the whole armor of God. Every single day, dying to ourselves and living with purpose, with Jesus in mind. I am a soldier. Number 2, he says, I'm a runner. I'm a runner. He refers to an athlete. He refers to not a sprinter, but someone that runs cross country. He refers to himself as a runner, and he says, I've stayed the course. A lot of people start the race, but very few finish it. It's not enough to start the race. It's not enough to run the race, but Paul makes it very clear, you must finish the race. Paul didn't reach the end of his days to contemplate the things he hadn't done, or the things that he wished he did. But Paul also wants to encourage us that when you fall, get back up and keep running. Get back up and keep running. I love what it says in Hebrews, and we're going to start Hebrews next week. But it says this in Hebrews 12. The author says, let us run with endurance. The Christian life is not a sprint, but it's a cross country. It's an endurance every single day, dying to ourselves and living for Jesus. Let us run with endurance the race that lies before us. Looking to Jesus, the source and perfecter of our faith. I'm a runner. And what the author of Hebrews is saying in this verse is, he's saying, run your own race. That God has specifically given every single person in this room their own race to run. Specifically marked out with your name on it. It's not your neighbor's race. Parents, it's not your kid's race. It's not your friend's race. It's not your hero's race. God has given you your own race to run. And he said, sink into that and look towards me, the perfecter and source of your faith. Don't compare yourself with other people, because when you run someone else's race, you don't run the race that God has specifically designed you for. And I feel like that's a big thing in our culture, because we're always in the comparison game. Well, I don't like my race. I want to run someone else's race. And we find ourselves in this comparison trap, but all comparison does is everybody loses. And God said, you are created with a purpose. I have given you a race to run your own race. Keep your eyes on Jesus. You've heard me say this before, but eyes up and vision forward. Eyes up, vision forward. As an athlete, if you run, whether it's sprints or distance, you're always taught to run through the finish line. So many times we get distracted by things that are around us, things that are behind us, and that's the same idea of life. So many times we're running the race that God has for us, and situations happen, circumstances happen, things that catch us off guard. There's doubt, there's confusion, there's fear. And what Jesus is saying in 2 Timothy as well as in Hebrews, he's saying, keep your eyes on me. run the race that I've given you. I'm not just a soldier. I'm not just a runner. But the third thing, he says, I'm a steward. I'm a steward. Paul didn't just preach it. He guarded it. He kept the faith. As a believer, you are a steward fulfilling the sacred trust of God. Guard the faith. Guard the truth. Defend the faith. We live in a culture in our society where you walk out these doors and they will say there's no absolute truth. We live in a culture and society where things are changing. And what Paul is saying and what Jesus is saying, as a Christ follower, you are to take a stand. To not just say yes to Jesus, but to guard the faith. Steward this faith where everyone that sees you outside these doors and outside this building know that you are a light and that Jesus mirrors everything of who you are. Are you stewarding the faith? As Christ followers, we are called to holiness. And we must steward that and keep that. And Paul ends in verse 8 by saying this. Now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. So we see Paul, he looks around at the situations and circumstance, and he knows his time is short. Paul looks back at his life and knows that he has given everything of who he is to steward the faith, to run with endurance, and to fight the good fight as a soldier. But in this last verse, what Paul does is he looks forward. He looked ahead. As a Greek or Roman athlete who was a winner, was rewarded by the crowds during that time, usually got a laurel wreath or a garland of oak leaf on them. They were awarded this as a winner. However, Paul would not be given a faded crown of leaves, but instead Paul would be a crown of righteousness that would never fade. He also talks about Jesus Christ as the righteous judge. He judges things correctly. That one day when Jesus comes back, everything will be judged correctly. He is the righteous judge. And the crown of righteousness is God's reward for a faithful and righteous life. Someone that fights the good fight, someone that runs with endurance, and someone that stewards the faith. It says this in John 11, verse 25 and 26. It says, I am the resurrection and the life. And anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die. This means that when you die, you will be in the presence of God, not just the reward of being in heaven, because that's a reward in itself, but also receiving a crown. All throughout Scripture, Jesus talks about crowns that he will award once we're in heaven. And those that are faithful and abide in him. As we conclude this morning, all of us fall into these two categories. Number one, you find yourself in this room and you have never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ. You might be here for the very first time. You might have been coming for several weeks, but there's never been that moment that you have said yes to Jesus, recognizing the things that he's already done in your life. You have nothing to do. You can't earn salvation. You can't come to church enough times. You can't do anything. Ephesians 2:8-9 says that you are saved by grace through faith. And as you look at your life, has there been a moment that you have said yes to him and your life has been changed and transformed by the gospel? Number 2, it's all about how you finish the race. Maybe you're in this room today and you're not investing your life well. You're stuck on temporary things. Maybe you're not following Jesus. Maybe you're not abiding in Jesus. Maybe the enemy has trapped you in your shame, in your guilt. And what Paul wants you to be encouraged with today, and Jesus wants you to be encouraged with today, it's all about how you finish. Get back up and run with endurance. Eyes up, vision forward. And some of you are here this morning, you're tired. You're exhausted. Maybe from situations, maybe from circumstances, maybe as a father, you've not been investing well in your family dynamic. Maybe towards your spouse. As a mother, maybe you're here in this room and maybe you haven't really been investing everything of who you are in other people. When you die, how are you going to be remembered? And as we respond this morning, I want to encourage you to make room for Jesus. Wherever you are in this room, maybe you need to say yes to Jesus. Maybe you need to take your next step in baptism. Maybe you need you want more information on how to join this church. And all those 3 things are fantastic, and we want you to take those next steps in that. We're going to have pastors at the front of this altar, and if that's you, we want you to go to them and we want to pray with you. But I specifically want to encourage families in the room today. Individuals in the room today, students, college students, how are you investing your life? And our prayer this morning is that you make room for Jesus in your life. Don't ignore this time. Don't get distracted by this time. I would love and encourage to see husbands gather their families and come at the altar and pray. Spouses praying together. Maybe there's a prayer request on your mind, and Jesus tells us if it's on our mind, it's on Jesus' heart. There's a lot of things going on in our church, people dealing with different things. One word things that defines everything of who we are. And Jesus defined the greatest word ever in history when he said to Telestai, it is finished. How are you going to respond this morning? Every head bowed, every eye closed. God, we're thankful for this time to gather this morning. I'm thankful that we can open up your word and we have a God that speaks. He's not distant. He's not removed from your life, but you are present. And God, I pray for every single person that's in this room. Maybe there's individuals here this morning that have never made that decision to say yes to you. Father, with boldness and courage, I pray they take that next step. But God, I pray for families. I pray for individuals as we deal with a heavy topic, a heavy word like death. God, I pray that we look back on our life currently right now as well, and we look at our life moving forward. What are we investing it in? God, I pray that we make room for you this morning. As God is speaking to your hearts and as we sing this song, I pray that you move and you respond how God is calling you to do.